Before we take a break, I do want to follow up on a story we've been talking about since really the death of Steve Jobs, even before. On the last show, we talked about suicides and aluminum dust explosions and labor problems at Foxconn, one of Apple's main manufacturers. And Lewis, in what seemed to be a very callous, out of control, vindictive rant, said that he doesn't care about the Chinese people and that he will continue to buy Apple products no matter what. Is that a rough summary?
It's a piss poor summary.
Okay.
Yeah.
In any event, it turns out that upon doing more research, there is some nonsense circulating about Apple and Foxconn and Chinese manufacturing. And I got an email saying, from an audience member saying they heard me grilling Lewis about feeling guilty about buying a Foxconn product. And then it turns out that Foxconn has a lower suicide rate than many other Chinese companies, and that even lower than the Chinese national average, employed or not, which is definitely a mitigating statistic, I have to admit.
Right. Well, when you've got, let's say watchdog groups, who are they looking at? They're looking at the huge companies. They're looking at Apple. They're going to go after whoever they can. And I mean, it's kind of like a snowball effect. You know, once these suicides start happening, this company's linked to Apple. It just keeps growing. And
well, before you even go that far.
But when you think about how much electronics are actually manufactured in China,
yeah,
it's staggering. And Foxconn is such a tiny, tiny percentage of that.
Well, here's the other thing. The suicide rate at Foxconn is also lower than the average United States company suicide rate, according to new reports that I've looked at. And the accident rate turns out to also be lower than many other Chinese and American companies. So, you know, I think that maybe what is happening here, I'm not saying we shouldn't care about what's happening there.
There could be some statistic skewing here.
But from the evidence I've seen, and I know I will get emails now counterbalancing and pushing to the other direction, it seems I may have been a little bit out of line in my criticism of Apple sourcing and Foxconn and Chinese manufacturing, which, by the way, Lewis now is glad because he was right about something. But you look for opportunities all the time to criticize China for their practices, and this actually doesn't seem to be one of the times you can do that. Does that make you upset?
No. I'm sure there are plenty of things we can find here that we can still criticize China about. Right. In particular with Foxconn, I guess things aren't as bad as we might have thought.
The other question is the one of wages, right? And the question of whether $17 a day is a low wage or not is really not the most relevant question. We have to look at, is it low relative to what, right? And for a start, people are making about $6,000 a year working these 6-day weeks at a company like Foxconn. It is certainly not great riches by our standards, but in China, it is considered a pretty average wage. I mean, it's round about the per capita GDP for the whole country. It's not higher than an average wage, but it really doesn't seem to be lower. And so again, when we look at that, is the problem that one company or factory, or is it more of a countrywide problem? And we could say, well, Apple and companies like Apple continue to put downward pressure on a lot of these companies to keep the GDP that low. It's complicated. We can't really say which way is it trickling.
Right. But I mean, going back a little bit to the suicides, one of the major things that I don't think we've ever talked about with regard to the suicides is that the vast majority of these people are migrant workers, and migrant workers are almost everywhere in China, and they travel hundreds of miles to go, or more, maybe thousands, to go work in places like this because it's the only place they can. They're away from their families, they're away from their home, they're away from everything for incredibly long periods of time.
Sure.
And that has got to add to some of the depression and the suicides. I don't think it's all related just to work conditions at Foxconn.
No question about it. And then that brings us back to the country. What should the country be doing to make it so people don't have to travel hundreds of miles to be away from their families for months in order to even make an average wage?
Right.
And let's also be clear that wages have been growing in China pretty strongly recently. I mean, since the late 90s, they've been growing at about 14% per year after inflation is accounted for, and it's even been accelerating the last couple of years. If you have an iPhone or Android phone, speaking of which, if you've decided to get an iPhone, or an Android phone. You can hear the show on the go at Stitcher.com/David Pakman Show, or just download the Stitcher application. If you put in promo code DAVID, you'll get the show put right in your favorites, and you'll be helping to support the David Pakman Show. So certainly check out Stitcher. Let's take a break. We have to talk about what's going on with Planned Parenthood and the Susan G. Komen Foundation. It's despicable and it's sickening, and we'll talk about that next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.